Welcome to Story Capital, where history and strategy drive success.
You can almost feel the chill in the air that morning in Munich, not just the winter kind that stings your face, but a cold that has nothing to do with weather. It's the kind that lives in boardrooms and bank vaults, the metallic taste of a decision that could end an empire. Picture the Munich Congress Hall on December 9, 1959, a sea of more than 2,500 people, coats buttoned up against the cold, breath puffing out like little ghosts in the hall. There's a hush, but it's the kind of hush that's electric, like the moment before a race flag drops. Except this time, the race is for something messier than trophies. It's for identity, for survival, for a brand that had meant speed, engineering, wings, and somehow soul. BMW wasn't booming in 1959. West Germany was celebrating its Wirtschaftswunder, wonder, the economic miracle, tallies of factories humming, export figures climbing, workers enjoying new prosperity. But BMW was the tragic exception, the awkward kid at the party who can't keep up. Once a company that built engines for the fastest planes in the sky, BMW had lost entire factories in the East after the war. Eisenach, their historical plant, had been seized by Soviet forces. In Munich, what remained felt like a hollow shell, staff and plant, but not the momentum. Imagine walking the factory floors in those years, the scent of oil and metal, the slow hum of machinery that sounded tired instead of purposeful, engineers bent over designs that seemed confused about what BMW should be. The company's lineup felt schizophrenic. On one end there was the 507, a convertible so gorgeous that Elvis Presley bought two. It was a specimen of design brilliance, a thing of lust and admiration. It was also an accounting nightmare. Each unit cost far more than it brought in. On the other end was the Isetta, a bubble car that looked like a rounded refrigerator with a door on the front. The Isetta was cute, adored by city drivers and magazines, a cult success, but the margins were microscopic. It was cash flow theater, pretty to look at, but incapable of paying the bills. In that pincer movement of failure, BMW was crushed between being too small to fight the big players and too scattered to define a profitable niche. Creditors watched nervously. Among them, Deutsche Bank played a starring role. As BMW primary creditor, Deutsche Bank didn't just worry. It started whispering a more permanent solution. Liquidation had its own cold logic. Banks don't love drama. They love balance sheets that reconcile. Enter Daimler-Benz Mercedes. Picture the great old company with its stately cars, conservative engineering, and a hunger for scale. Deutsche Bank brokered a plan. Mercedes would rescue BMW. That rescue, however, was more Trojan Horse than savior. The terms were clinical. Mercedes would use BMW workforce to fill its own labor shortages. They'd repurpose BMW Milbertshofen plant to splice into Mercedes' assembly system, turning proud, independent production into a cog in another machine. Ultimately, the idea was to swallow BMW assets and snuff out the brand, the past glory of planes and precision, to be folded into the practicality of a larger company. The BMW name, once connected to daring machines and a distinct culture, would be relegated to a footnote. The plan required a shareholder vote. That's why the Congress Hall was full on that cold December morning. Board members in suits took the stage. At the helm was Hans Fieth, a director who also represented Deutsche Bank, a glaring conflict of interest that didn't go unnoticed by everyone in the room. The board presented a 50-page restructuring plan that looked, on the surface, tidy and logical. Technically insolvent, they said. The language was formal and final. They pushed the fear button. Accept the merger or face bankruptcy by noon. The meeting was packed with shareholders who had come expecting either a lifeline or a eulogy. Here's where the story sharpens into real human drama. The board had miscalculated one thing. They underestimated the dealers. The people who sell cars often have more skin in the game than institutional creditors. They're rooted in neighborhoods, in local economies, in livelihoods. BMW dealer network, led by figures like Friedrich Mathern, understood the stakes better than the bankers did. A Mercedes takeover wouldn't just change badges on hoods. It would wipe out businesses and crush livelihoods. Dealers saw themselves not as cogs, but as guardians of a heritage. They began to resist. This wasn't a Hollywood-style uprising with banners and megaphones. It was a legal insurgency, sharp, technical, and relentless. The dealers and their legal advisers started to pore over documents and procedures. They found cracks and then widened them. They questioned the audit. They claimed that the board had hidden potential upside, specifically the upcoming BMW 700. They argued that the development costs for the 700 had been dumped into a single fiscal year as a total loss to make the books look worse than they were. In plain terms, the balance sheet had been manipulated to make a sale look necessary. The hall turned into a theater of chaos. For nearly 10 hours, the meeting descended into turmoil. Shareholders stood on chairs, voices rose, people shouted, papers rustled. The Mercedes executives, who expected a tidy transfer of power, sat increasingly uncomfortable in the front row, their polished shoes and tailored suits stark against the cacophony. The atmosphere shifted from solemn to volcanic. The board's carefully staged script fell apart. And in that chaos, the story takes a turn that reads like fate, but in truth, it was a calculated decision by a single man, Herbert Quandt. Quiet, private, near-sighted, Quandt didn't look like a movie hero. He had the kind of presence that didn't demand attention, but once you listened, the gravity was unmistakable. He owned roughly 10% of BMW at the time. He had initially been leaning toward the sale. Banks had whispered reassurance, and the pressure from the West German government leaned the same way. Save jobs, stabilize the market, wrap up the mess. But people influence other people. Herbert's half, Brother Harold Quandt, and his lead advisor, Horst Gregory, planted the seed of a different path. They weren't dreamers. They were practical and ruthless in their calculations. They noticed what the dealers and the rebellious shareholders had noticed. The BMW 700 had pre-orders. Not a modest amount. Numbers in the tens of thousands. It was a pulse in a battlefield patient. If that pulse was real, it was worth holding on to. And then Herbert decided to act. He did something risky, and he did it fast. He essentially engineered a modern corporate short squeeze before the term was widely used. He chose to freeze the room to stop the vote to buy time. He ignored Deutsche Bank's threats and the quiet pressure from political leaders. He decided to stake his family's industrial holdings, batteries, chemicals, and other businesses on a company that many thought was a sinking ship. That's not bravado. That's high-stakes calculation mixed with a belief that a company's soul can be rebuilt. When technical objections forced the meeting to adjourn without a conclusive vote, Mercedes realized the game had changed. The window for a clean acquisition slammed shut. Meanwhile, Herbert Quandt went into the market. For weeks, he bought up shares like a man building a fortress, one brick at a time. He increased his stake from 10% to nearly half the company. With that kind of control, he moved decisively. He relieved the board members who'd pushed the sale and gave the engineering teams the one thing they had lacked, trust and resources. That gamble was the seed for the new class. The engineers who had been suffocated by short-term financial panic were allowed to breathe again. They were given money to develop something bold, practical, and honest. The result was the 1500, the first of the new class, a car that flipped the script. It was sharp, light, and unavoidably precise in its handling. Rather than competing with Mercedes on their own turf of stately, heavy luxury, BMW reinvented what an executive car could be: sporty, driver, focused, and efficient. The philosophy was simple and radical: build cars that put the driver first, not in marketing copy, but in engineering, lighter weight, sharper handling, and engines that sang when you asked for more. The new class created a new segment, the executive sports sedan, and laid the groundwork for everything BMW would later be credited with. The 3 Series, the M5, the ultimate driving machine identity. Without Herbert Quandt's intervention, none of that, at least in the form we recognize today, would likely exist. There's something almost cinematic about the aftermath. Dealers who had banded together found their livelihoods secured. Engineers who had been second, guessed now had a mandate. Herbert Quandt, the reluctant savior, quietly became the architect of one of the most successful turnarounds in automotive history. Mercedes watched from the wings. The company that had once schemed to absorb BMW instead found itself in a rivalry that would define prestige and performance for generations. You can see the echo of that moment on the Autobahn today. When a BMW driver flashes their lights at a Mercedes, it's more than road etiquette or ego. It's an act folded into a history of survival and defiance. It's a gesture that carries the memory of a cold hall, a shouting match, and a shareholder revolt that refused to accept being sold out. But this isn't a fairy tale with a single hero and a tidy moral. The story contains complexities and uncomfortable truths. Deutsche Bank's role wasn't simply villainous bureaucracy. They represented a legitimate concern about financial risk. Daimler-Benz recognized a real strategic opportunity. Some board members believed, perhaps sincerely, that selling was the responsible path to save jobs and limit losses. Even Herbert Quant's wealth was in part built on difficult and morally ambiguous foundations. History rarely offers clean good guys and bad guys. It gives us decisions, pressures, and the messy outcomes that come from human beings trying to do the best they can, often guided by self-interest. The 507 and the Isetta, the two symbols of BMW identity crisis in 1959, are also part of the lesson. Beauty without profitability is fragile. Novelty without a path to sustainable cash flow is a dead end. Yet the very existence of those cars, music, romance, and quirk kept a cultural heartbeat alive. They reminded people that BMW could be more than a ledger item. The 700's pre-orders were proof that customers still wanted what BMW could uniquely offer. The moral of the story might be that a company is a sum of things. Balance sheets, yes, but also dealers, artisans, engineers, and the public imagination. The mid-century rescue stitched those pieces back together. The new class's success wasn't just engineering. It was an alignment of belief and financing, of dealers and factories, and of a single man's willingness to bet everything on a vision. It wasn't easy. It required shifting priorities, cutting what didn't work and investing in what did. It demanded humility from leaders and courage from shareholders. Fast forward a few decades and BMW is a global icon. The rivalry with Mercedes is a kind of cultural duel, flashes of lights on the Autobahn, a tug of war for performance cred on road tests, and a marketplace battle that has pushed both companies to innovate. But the rivalry's origin is not just corporate strategy or marketing wars. It's a near-death story, a corporate assassination attempt, if you want to be dramatic about it, an attempt to suffocate a brand at its most vulnerable, thwarted by angry dealers, a legal insurgency, and a man who decided to bet his fortune on potential over panic. When you think about business, it's tempting to reduce decisions to numbers. That's comfortable. But corporate history is full of irrational moves that turn out to be genius, and rational moves that end up being catastrophes. What happened in Munich in 1959 is a reminder that institutions are made by people, flawed, stubborn, ambitious, even sentimental. That sometimes a messy democratic moment, a raucous shareholder meeting, can be the hinge on which history turns, that it's worth remembering the local dealer who refused to fold his shop, the engineer who kept sketching, and the owner who gambled his fortune on faith in a product. If you ever see a photo of a BMW 507 or an Isetta parked on a cobblestone street, take a moment to imagine the cold hall, the shouting, the legal objections, and the weeks of frantic share purchases. Every emblem, every grille, and every engine note has that memory embedded under the metal. For BMW, the near-death experience of 1959 didn't just save a company, it forged its identity. It turned a near failure into an existential refocus. So next time two cars roll neck and neck on the Autobahn and someone flashes the lights, remember what that flash could mean, not just bravado, but a wink at history, a recognition that sometimes a firm hand and a risky heart can change not just a company's fate, but the shape of an industry, and that legends are often the result of stubbornness, timing, and the willingness of a few people to fight like mad for something they believe still has worth.